I'm Adele. I'm a tax director here at Cooper Parry. So if you're anything like me, you woke up quite excited last Wednesday morning. But I very quickly got put in my place and back in my box because I was trying to explain tax to my daughter. Let's just say she'd rather watch Bluey. Anyway, my husband found that very funny. So I'm sure you've all heard the highlights. What I'm going to try and do today is talk about the highlights, dissect those highlights a little bit more, get back to the reality of what they actually mean, but also talk a little bit about the fine print of what probably wasn't announced on the day. So obviously the big headline was national insurance, the 2% reduction in employees' national insurance that's coming in from the 6th of January next year. From a self-employed perspective, there's the class 2s have been abolished and class 4 has had a 1% reduction that's coming in from the 6th of April next year. Going on to capital allowances, that's been made permanent. The full expensing has been made permanent, and then there's a few consultations coming out on pensions. In terms of Midlands, was big news on investment zones for both East and West Midlands, and there's an extension on tax reliefs from 5 years up to 10 years. And finally, there's an apparent simplification of the R&D regime, which Mark is going to cover a bit later on after the break. So, I'll cover a bit about the businesses first. So we'll start off with capital allowances. For those that came here for the spring FD seminar, I went through the history of capital allowances and what that actually meant and the apparent simplification that's actually made it all more complicated for us as tax advisors. So the full expensing has been made permanent. I think we always knew that would probably be the case under a Conservative government. But the reality is, in comparison to the olden days, pre-super deduction, there hadn't used to be a tax charge on disposal unless it was a special asset. Now, if you claim full expensing or super deduction, you now have to track every single asset. And if it gets disposed of, there's now a tax charge on disposal. So it's definitely not simplified, it's definitely more complicated. So what do we do? What we're trying to do is still make use of the AIA, because if you use the AIA, the annual investment allowance that is, there isn't a tax charge on disposal. So obviously that seems a lot more beneficial. However, one thing that has been established and came out in a small print after the spring budget was a very, very small change in the definition of associated companies. So before, what was the definition used to be a 51% control within a group. That has now changed to controlled by a person or persons. So it now captures companies that are not just within the group, sister companies outside the group as well, if they're controlled by the same shareholders. So that means there can be we're seeing it with some of our clients, the number of associated companies has significantly increased. So not only does that bring people into quarterly instalments quicker, but it's also meaning that 1 million annual investment allowance is now spread over a lot more companies. And obviously, corporation tax rate is still 25%. So yes, reality is full expensing has been made permanent, but is it a benefit? There's tax charges and it's not quite as beneficial as it used to be. However, there was some consultations announced in this fine print that there's going to be an apparent simplification. I say apparent because I'm getting cynical these days of simplification of capital allowances has generally made it more complicated. So we'll see what this consultation is going to evolve into. And then something probably more for the construction industry is they're going to look to extend some of the first year allowance benefits for leased equipment. Because at the moment you can only get it on brand new owned fixed assets, not on leased. I've kind of covered the investment zones already, but from an East Midlands perspective, they're looking at specific green technologies and advanced manufacturing, and it's going to cover Nottinghamshire, Derby and Derbyshire. So you'll get enhanced tax relief on capital allowances, stamp duty, land tax, national insurance and business rates. Some of the sort of smaller print within the document published last week was business rates for smaller businesses in certain sectors. There's enhanced relief for those that are continuing. I think that's sort of a welcome benefit, especially for the retail and hospitality sort of industries at the moment. In terms of VAT relief, there's going to be an extension to installation of energy saving materials, so that's going to be extended to additional technologies. Those that are impacted by plastic packaging tax, that was announced that it's going to increase with the Consumer Price Index from the 1st of April next year. And then as part of a bigger picture, they're looking at increasing the number of apprenticeships. So there's additional funding for more apprentices going into engineering and key growth sectors. Got another one for the construction industry is this another consultation. There seems to be a lot of consultations announced within this budget report. So there's going to be a consultation to simplify the scheme. But as a second part of that, they're now looking at adding VAT into the gross payment status compliance test. And that is to try and tackle a bit of the fraud going on in the construction industry. Another consultation that was announced was in respect to pensions. There seems to be a bit of a topic coming out on pensions to encourage investment into UK, and to protect funds more. I think especially with the economy the way it's been of recent time, they want to make sure that UK pension funds are safe and secure. So one thing that I thought was really quite interesting was they want to try and create a pension pot for life. So when employees move jobs and they have a pension pot here and a pension pot here and a pension pot there, what they're going to be looking at doing is one pension pot for the employee, and the employer is going to be paying into the old employee's pension fund. Not sure how that's going to work yet. It's just a consultation, but it makes sense that pension funds don't get lost. It just sounds like the onus is going to be on the employers rather than the employees. And then apart from that, they're going to encourage more investment into UK businesses and make them more secure pension pots effectively. One element that we can never seem to avoid in a budget, in the small print, there was a little bit about IR35, again for the construction industry. So they're going to be applying new legislation that if there's a deemed employer and they've fallen foul of the legislation, HMRC are going to have some regulation that they can now deduct any income tax that's been paid by the deemed employee off the deemed employer's PAYE liability out of the investigation, which I think is good news. And then probably one of the more controversial elements that was announced as part of the budget was the Back to Work plan. Over a 5-year period, they're going to encourage the long-term unemployed back to work. And this is going to be through job centres with a 3-phase approach over an 18-month period. So there's going to be additional training available to the unemployed. There's going to be support for CVs, interview training, and if an unemployed person doesn't engage in this process, their benefits are going to be taken away from them. As aside from that, there's also going to be more support for both employers and employees with those with health and disability issues. to try and probably encourage more flexible working and get those with health and disability issues back into work and back working to reduce benefits. Now, this wasn't actually announced on the day. It's probably more a recap that was within the document that was published later that day, and it's on the OECD Pillar 2 international tax reform. So this only really impacts on the multinational enterprises. So it's to curb the diversion of profits into low tax jurisdictions. And all the territories that have signed up to this will mean there's going to be a minimum 15% effective tax rate across all jurisdictions, which I think we'll all think is fair based on a lot of the bigger enterprises that we've heard don't pay any UK tax. And there's more than 30 countries that have now signed up to that, and the UK will start on that in 2024. Some have already made steps to join in with this protocol, and there's more expected to join over the next couple of years. So moving on to individuals. The headline was cutting tax and rewarding hard work. So we'll see what that actually means and whether they've delivered. So national insurance, we all know, as a kind of recap, the 2% drop. He's rushing through the legislation for that, so it's effective from the 6th of January. Before he announced the employees' national insurance, he made a big deal of rewarding the self-employed. And he says how great it was during COVID, and they put themselves out there, they went into people's homes and really put themselves out, so really going to reward the hard work that the self-employed did during COVID. And yet they're not rushing that one through. That's not coming in until the 6th of April. It's also a 1% reduction rather than a 2% reduction. So I'm not quite sure how that's rewarding those that put themselves out there for COVID. And there's also the NHS, who are all employed, who did, I'm sure you'll all agree, really put themselves out there during COVID. And then the really hard-hitting part is that income tax bands are still frozen. So the stealth tax that we've all been accustomed to over the last few years, we're all paying more tax. And I think we'll probably all agree during COVID, there was a lot of support out there. We were all going to have to pay for it eventually. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there who seem to have forgotten about all that support during COVID, and the country's still got to repay that funding that was provided to everyone. Unfortunately, what the freezing of the tax bands means is by 2028, if we continue along this is going to be the highest tax burden in the post-war era. So even though we've had the big headlines of national insurance cuts, we're still going to be in the biggest tax burden in the post-war era by 2028 under the current legislation. I say that with a caveat, under the current one. Some of the smaller parts within the legislation, within the budget announcement, were the national living wage increase by £1 and a reduction in the age threshold from 23 down to 21. As we all know, in spring, pensions, the lifetime allowance was abolished, but the reality of that is there's still the annual allowances and the tapering that restricts the amount you can still put in a pension. But the good news is the state pension will be going up by 8.5% from April, and he's honoured the triple lock. And as I'm sure quite a few of you in this room will be very pleased that alcohol duty has been frozen across the board for another year. And then something that was really hidden away in the fine print was about ISAs. They're looking at increasing simplification, increasing options, and making it much easier to transfer funds between ISAs as well. So, what was there no mention of in the budget? The rumours leading up to the budget was stamp duty land tax. Was he going to do something with stamp duty land tax to try and kickstart the housing market? That was ominously quiet. Capital gains tax. I mention this because there's always rumours about capital gains tax in the lead up to some sort of budget or autumn statement. There was no rumours, there was no mention. Inheritance tax. Now, there was a lot of rumours about inheritance tax getting reduced, even down to as much as 20%. And then when the rumours came out about income tax reductions 2 days before, the inheritance tax rumours died off. Now, we suspect that they have now been deferred until the spring. So what they've done, I think, is they've gone for the more headline announcement across the board to try and increase votes. I think Conservatives do need some sort of popularity boost, so the national insurance was a bigger boost across the board than the inheritance tax one. So what next? Well, we will have an election coming up over the next 12 months. So what if there's a change of government? With the economy the way it is, after COVID, the Russian war, inflation, Mark Beresford-Smith will come on to say this a bit later on, but there is no low tax credible option. The Conservatives will undoubtedly argue that the taxes will be lower under them than under Labour. But, as I probably alluded to a little bit, the Conservatives have made some permanent changes within this autumn statement, but how permanent is permanent when it comes to government? I don't think their definition of permanent is quite the same as ours. And then looking at, well, if there is a change of government, what are we expecting the changes to be? Inheritance tax, I'm sure that will come back on the agenda in the spring. And then if Labour come into power, we think that there'll be changes to the domicile rules, especially after Rishi Sunak's wife's sort of debacle after he came in. We think there'll be some sort of changes to the domicile status. And then capital gains tax. The rumour is that they will increase capital gains tax. The main rate at the moment is 20%. But when you sell a property, it's 28%. So the logical thought is that they might increase the main rate of capital gains tax from 20% up to 28%. But what about business asset disposal relief? At the moment, you get your first $1 million at 10%, which used to be entrepreneurs relief, just for those that didn't know about the name change. It's not as generous as it used to be. Could there be any changes around that? I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. So that leaves nicely